Super abilities from Kirby's Return to Dreamland were insane and hands down the most iconic of the gimmicks in the Kirby series. Maybe that's just a nostalgia talking, but there's a reason it's still Kirby's Final Smash and Smash Bros, despite all the Kirby games that came out in recent years with their own gimmicks. Or maybe it might be because Supernova and Concept would have been way too morbid. As the evolutionary counterparts to the regular copy abilities, they just murdered everything on screen. Not like you needed help defeating enemies in a Kirby game anyways, but these new beefed up abilities provided for new forms of innovative gameplay and made sure you were absolutely tearing through this game. Although super abilities tend to be scarce in the world of Dreamland, only being present in 5 copy abilities. To be fair, it would be pretty boring if every copy ability had a super variant. You know, if everyone's super no one is blah blah blah, but a few more couldn't hurt. I just want a little more adrenaline pumping through my veins, so... Hey, this is Violet Red, and I made new super abilities for Kirby's Return to Dreamland. The first super ability I tried making was Spark. Spark has so much potential to be a super ability. I mean, in my opinion, it already gives off heavy super ability vibes, with the posing and the giant charge ball. Plus, most of the super abilities have weapons, so at least one of these abilities need to be purely energy based in some way. You know, to balance it out. Also, it's just one of my favorites. So now I gotta bring some ideas to the table. To my knowledge, the super abilities don't have that much in depth in terms of design. Most of the hats are just the regular hat but on roids. But most of them have light new tweaks to their ability and their attacks, so I figured it would be interesting to play off that in the designs. Then I looked towards the futuristic looking little energy slots on the front of the Spark crown, and was like, what if Super Spark's crown was representing this future magic generator or machine, kinda like these? I could turn the crown into 2 giant rings, which would be interesting enough to be entertaining, but could be executed in a simple enough manner to match the other super abilities, so it was worth a try. I started up with the pose and proportions, leaping forward and charging up to throw huge volts of electricity. Then I created the base of the crown, where I started messing around with where it would make sense to put the second ring over the crest of the crown. Meanwhile, I dabbled in detailing the high ring because the design started looking kinda plain. But when I added some antennae in attempts to give the design some depth, I fell in love with the idea of the ability being partially alien inspired, so I gave the outer sides of the upper ring circular nubs to reference UFO Kirby. Then I messed around with some electrical effects. I didn't want to just make it a giant orb, feeling like it would come off as underwhelming, because regular Spark copy ability Kirby already has an attack that's pretty similar to that. But the angular triangle fountain idea I looked into seemed like it would move a little bit awkwardly, so I gave into the idea of the central orb. But it has wild lightning bolts sparking out from it, forming a circle to make it feel more organized and practical. It also made the ability look kinda like Tornado, but shh, that'll be fixed in rendering. I finished off the rough sketch by assigning where the energy strips and iconic star on the crown would be. For the liner, I usually just do thick lines on the outside strictly, but this time I tried taking inspiration from the models from Return to Dreamland Deluxe, and created thicker lines on whole parts like the hands and the crown, regardless if they were outside or inside Kirby's body in their artwork. For the same reason, they will also be colored in, which was tedious but oddly fun at the same time. I didn't exactly know how I was going to texture the electricity, but I tried to emulate the regular Spark Crown's crystal-like shading as best as I could, and it kinda just worked out. Then I went into a second layer of detail, mainly off-screen, touching up the star, creating more motion lines in the swirly vortex, and adjusting lightning here and there. This is the super ability, Flying Sparks. For its attack, it creates an impressive wave of sparks that climb walls and ceilings it comes into contact with. It's actually a bit awkward because the super ability Flare Beam literally states in its in-game flavor text that it uses electricity, particularly to light things up. So Flying Sparks is sort of a copycat in that regard, but that's not my problem. I really did not expect this design to turn out as well as it did, but I vibe with the colors, I vibe with the poses, it still looks like the copy ability Tornado, but shh! Next up is a Kirby power-up that I thought was unnerving. Needle. I don't have a fear of thorns or needles, but it's pretty clear that Hal wanted you to be at least a little afraid of this copy ability. Whether it be the overkill amount of spikes in the hat, one of the enemies you can get from being a literal gaslighter, or the selection of freak show moves you can choose from, aka literally all of them. It would be fun to try to pull off a Masahiro Sakurai and create a design based on my own biased perception of the needle ability. I can imagine it being inspired by monsters or insects, maybe mosquitoes, and he uses it to suck the life out of his enemies. Child-friendly version, of course. I will admit, although I like the bug approach to start off with, maybe I took it a little bit too literally. In that I started off with making the hat a literal beetle shell. And yes, I know, but at the end of the day, I created a design that looked too different from the OG Needle. It looked cool, but it didn't look like a super ability, especially of Needle. I got a little too overzealous with the bug aesthetic, and I wasn't afraid to make it look different from Beetle, but I'll be honest, I just got lost and now I'm here. With a break and a new mindset, I started from scratch, and originally, I booted the brim of the Needle hat because I simply did not like it. But that's like the third detail of the power-up, and one of the only indications that this thing is Needle. So instead, I kept it and used the brim as a sort of jaw for the super ability, giving the bottom of the brim sharp spikes. But I'm not over the whole bias thing I mentioned earlier, so I made Kirby's face extra evil while wearing the hat. I had trouble with shaping the top of the hat, but I ended up throwing on less and less spikes till I had 3 and morphed the baseball cap of the Needle into a baseball helmet. The colors will of course be the same pink with the yellow spikes that Needle had, but the brim will be white to pull it apart from the spikes that are under it. This is Giant Thorn. I can imagine having Kirby shoot a giant needle from his mouth, bringing in items and enemies towards him. It was a struggle, but I'm satisfied with this ability. I was consistently worried while drawing that I'd have to take back my horribility gimmick. And I feel like I could have executed this a little bit better, maybe bring in the mosquito stuff that I was talking about earlier, but that might be a better design for another video. Finally, Fighter, the only combo ability that I know exactly what to do with. The Fighter ability first appeared in Kirby Superstar on the Super Nintendo, the first Kirby game to introduce a command list with multiple moves for each Kirby ability. And it's fairly obvious, but Fighter specifically has a somewhat familiar headband with very familiar moves. Catch my drift? Look, I'm not saying it's basically just Ryu from Street Fighter, but it's basically just Ryu from Street Fighter. You can only throw so many legally distinct Hadoukens until someone starts noticing parallels. But what I'm saying is, since we have our own Halbrand Ryu, why not create a more villainous counterpart in Halbrand Akuma? I tried to put Kirby in a stance similar to the Raging Demon, Akuma's signature technique, but it was pretty difficult considering Kirby's stubby body and I didn't want to hide the face, so I got pretty loose with how I wanted the stance to be represented. I resorted to this lunging forward position, which will change a little bit later. I thought about adding 2 bandanas instead of the normal one, making one red and one blue to reference Akuma and Evil Ryu's blue geese. Ultimately, I decided it might overcomplicate the design, so I just kept to the one. Then I worked on the hair, which was a simplified version of the spiky hair that Evil Ryu had. Then I experimented with adding some details in the bandana, like making the floating cloth strips in the back bigger and longer, adding tears into the cloth, and a bunch of stars along the part of the bandana that covers Kirby's forehead. I took all my ideas and mashed them together to see which ones would work. I changed the position and the numbers of flowing parts of the bandana, and I kept the triangular tears. I also changed the hair to be more stylized and be a tad more accurate to the references. I didn't know how to render the hair. I knew I wanted to give it a red tint, but I also wanted to make it black. I tried shooting the hair in an anime-esque style, but then transitioned to a softer style that fit with the rest of the rendering. Last minute, I also changed the eyes and hair to red because reference. This is Violent Fighter, and while I don't have a single attack idea for the super ability, I do have multiple. Probably one of these, maybe one of these, or a baby's first version of one of these, and look at him! He's awesome! So this is what it would be like if they added more super abilities in Kirby's Return to Dreamland. Or if HAL Laboratories went bankrupt and someone gave Rob 3 pieces of oddly well-rendered concept art for 3 unused super abilities from the rubble. Well, if you have any suggestions, criticisms, or comments, I'd love to hear it. I could definitely think about a couple things I'd change about each design. Anyways, consider liking and subscribing if you want to hang around. And I've been Vile. See ya.